James sat in a bustling airport lounge, glancing occasionally at the large departure board overhead. His flight to Tokyo was still 2 hours away. He tapped his fingers nervously on the armrest of his chair, feeling a mix of excitement and unease about the business trip ahead. Success had always been his driving force, but lately, the thrill seemed to be wearing off. He leaned back, exhaling deeply, when his phone vibrated on the table next to his coffee cup. A notification. He reached for it absently, but the moment his eyes skimmed the screen, his heart skipped a beat. It was a message from an unknown number. "You are about to meet a part of your past you never knew existed." He frowned, staring at the words. For a second, he wondered if it was a prank, but something about the message felt unsettlingly real. His mind raced. He thought of every possible scenario: old debts, enemies, even a scorned ex-client. But why now? And why at an airport? Before he could overthink it, his gaze wandered across the sea of people, and that's when he saw her. Claire. His heart lurched. His ex-wife, the woman he hadn't seen or spoken to in nearly 15 years. She was just across the terminal, standing next to a row of seats, and she wasn't alone. There was a young girl with her, around 14 or 15, with wavy chestnut hair and a nervous smile. The girl's resemblance to him was uncanny, as if someone had taken the features of his youth and combined them with Claire's grace. James felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. He stood, legs trembling, trying to process the shock. Claire's eyes met his, widening in surprise and then quickly turning guarded. She whispered something to the girl, who looked at James with curious eyes, then back at Claire, confused. He took a tentative step forward, unsure if his legs would support him. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of all those unspoken years bore down on him. He had never expected to see Claire again, much less accompanied by a teenager who could very well be his daughter. "Claire," he managed, his voice barely more than a whisper, his throat tight with a mixture of disbelief and guilt. What's going on?" Claire's expression was a complex tapestry of emotions: anger, regret, fear, but above all, resolve. She put a protective hand on the girl's shoulder. "This is Marie," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious tension between them. "And yes, James, she's yours." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. For a moment, everything around him blurred. His mind raced back to the last time they had spoken, the fights, the nights he had chosen work and ambition over family. Claire had left, taking the remnants of their broken marriage with her. He had never looked back, burying himself in work, telling himself it was all for the best. "Marie," he repeated, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. He looked at the girl, his daughter, and saw a flash of recognition in her eyes. She didn't look scared, but wary, like a wild animal uncertain whether to flee or fight. "Hi," Marie said softly, her voice barely audible amidst the airport's background noise. There was an awkward pause. James searched for words, but nothing seemed right. How do you start a conversation with a child you've never known? A child you unknowingly abandoned? He swallowed hard, forcing a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Hi, Marie. It's nice to meet you." Claire's grip on Marie's shoulder tightened, a silent signal. Marie looked up at her mother, then back at James, her expression unreadable. James wanted to reach out, to say something, anything, to explain himself, but what was there to say? That he didn't know? That he would have been different if he had? "You're leaving, aren't you?" Claire asked, her voice brittle. "Always running off to another city, another deal. Some things never change." James flinched. He felt a surge of defensiveness, a familiar old pattern ready to resurface, but he pushed it down. This wasn't about him and Claire anymore. It was about the girl standing between them, a girl who deserved more than the silence and bitterness that had defined their relationship. "I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I swear, Claire, I didn't know." "I didn't want you to know," Claire snapped, her eyes flashing. "You weren't ready, James. You were never ready. And I wasn't going to let Marie grow up around that." He wanted to argue, to say he could have been different, that he deserved a chance, but deep down he knew she was right. Back then, he wasn't the kind of man who could have raised a child. He was barely the kind of man who could keep a marriage. Marie shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at the crowd that had begun to take notice of the heated exchange. James forced himself to calm down. He took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. Can we talk somewhere?" he asked, desperation seeping into his voice. "Please, just give me a chance to explain, to get to know her." Claire hesitated, torn between protecting her daughter and offering James a sliver of the redemption he seemed so desperately to seek. Finally, she nodded. "There's a cafe around the corner," she said. "We can talk there." "But James," she added, her voice lowering to a fierce whisper, "this isn't a game. If you're not serious, if you're not ready, you walk away right now." James nodded, his throat too tight to speak. This was his one chance, his only chance, and he wasn't going to blow it. As they made their way to the cafe, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Fear, hope, regret. He couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could build something from the fragments that remained. And as they sat down at the small, round table, James realized this wasn't just a part of his past he had never known. It was the future he had never imagined, and it was now or never. James sat across from Claire and Marie in the small cafe, his eyes shifting nervously between them. The air was thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. He was struggling to find his footing, his mind replaying the past like a broken record. "I still can't believe it," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "I had no idea." "Of course you didn't," Claire said sharply, her gaze fixed on the coffee cup in her hands. "You were always too busy, too caught up in your world to notice what was happening in mine." James flinched at the bitterness in her voice. He remembered those days too well. Late nights at the office, the constant pressure to succeed. He had been consumed by his ambitions, oblivious to the toll it was taking on his marriage. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said quietly. "I thought, if I worked hard enough, made enough money, everything would be okay." Claire's laugh was harsh, almost cruel. "You really think money was the answer to everything, don't you?" Marie shifted in her seat, her eyes darting between her parents. "Can you two not fight?" she asked softly. "This is weird enough already." James felt a pang of guilt. He looked at Marie, really looked at her for the first time. She was so young, so vulnerable, and yet there was a strength in her eyes, a resilience that made his heart ache. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for everything, Marie. I didn't know you existed. I didn't know I had a daughter." Marie shrugged, her gaze falling to her hands. "Well, now you do." James struggled to find the right words. What could he say to this girl he had unknowingly abandoned? How could he make up for 15 years of absence with a few words? "I want to get to know you," he said finally, his voice earnest. "If you'll let me." Marie's eyes flickered with uncertainty. She looked at her mother, who gave a small, reluctant nod. Then she turned back to James, her expression guarded. "I guess we could try," she said slowly. "But I don't know if I can just, pretend everything's okay." James nodded, swallowing hard. "I don't expect that. I want a chance." They sat in silence for a moment, the awkwardness between them almost palpable. James felt like a stranger in his own life, desperately trying to navigate the unfamiliar terrain of fatherhood. "I never thought I'd see you again," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "After you left, I thought it was over." Claire looked up, her eyes softening for the first time. "It wasn't about you, James. It was about what was best for Marie." James nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had been so focused on his own pain, his own loss, that he had never stopped to think about what Claire and Marie had gone through. "I understand," he said quietly, "and I want to be part of her life. If you'll let me." Claire hesitated, then nodded slowly. "We'll see, James, but this is going to be on our terms. You don't get to just walk in and disrupt everything." "I know," James said, his voice firm. "I'll do whatever it takes." Marie glanced at him, her expression still wary but tinged with a hint of curiosity. "Why now?" she asked softly. "Why do you want to be part of my life now, after all these years?" James took a deep breath, his heart aching with regret. "Because I've changed, Marie. I've realized what's really important, and that's you. You and your mom." Marie looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then she nodded, a small, tentative gesture that filled James with a fragile hope. "Okay," she said quietly, "but you have to prove it." "I will," James promised, his voice thick with emotion. "I swear, I will." As they left the cafe, James felt a sense of relief mixed with a deep, aching sadness. He knew he had a long way to go, that trust was something that had to be earned, not given. But for the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose, like he had something worth fighting for. And as he watched Marie walk away with Claire, he knew that he would do whatever it took to be the father she deserved. The afternoon sun streamed through the cafe's large windows, casting long shadows across the table where James, Claire, and Marie sat. The atmosphere was charged with tension, the kind that only comes from years of unresolved pain. James felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, his mind racing with what to say next. Claire broke the silence first, her voice firm but not unkind. "James, if you really want to be part of Marie's life, you need to understand that this isn't just about showing up once or twice. It's about consistency, about being present. She needs to know she can count on you." James nodded, feeling the truth of her words. "I know. I'm not just here to make a token appearance. I want to be there for her, for both of you." Marie's eyes flashed with anger. "Why now, though? Why do you suddenly care?" The question hit James like a punch to the gut. He had anticipated this, but it still hurt to hear it out loud. How could he explain the years of selfishness, of putting his career above everything else? How could he make her understand that he wasn't the man he had once been? "I didn't know about you, Marie," he said softly. "If I had, I swear, I would have been there. But that doesn't excuse anything. I wasn't there for your mom, and I wasn't there for you. I made a lot of mistakes, but I'm here now, and I want to make it right." Marie's expression didn't soften. If anything, she seemed even more guarded. "You think you can just come back and everything will be fine? That will just forget all those years you weren't there?" "No, I don't," James replied, his voice steady despite the pain. "I know I have to earn your trust, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Marie's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly, her voice trembling with emotion. "You missed everything. All the things dads are supposed to be there for. You weren't. You don't get to just show up now and pretend like you care." James's heart shattered at her words. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, to somehow take away the pain. But he knew that wasn't what she needed. She needed to see that he could be the father she deserved, not through grand gestures, but through everyday actions. "I'm not pretending," he said quietly. "I do care. I've always cared. I just didn't know how to show it. I was scared of failing, of not being good enough. But that's not an excuse. I want to be part of your life, Marie. I want to get to know you, to be there for you, if you'll let me." Marie looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something. Truth, maybe, or sincerity. After what felt like an eternity, she glanced away, her jaw clenched. "I don't know if I can believe you." James nodded, accepting her words without protest. "That's okay. I understand. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to be here, no matter what." Claire watched the exchange, her eyes softening slightly. "Marie, we can't change what happened," she said gently. "But maybe, just maybe, we can try to move forward." Marie's gaze flickered between her parents, her expression torn. "I don't know if I want to," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James felt a surge of desperation. He wanted to plead with her, to beg for a chance. But he knew that would only push her further away. Instead, he took a deep breath and spoke from his heart. "I'm not going to force you into anything," he said softly. "All I'm asking for is a chance to show you that I've changed, that I can be someone you can count on." There was a long, painful silence. Then Marie nodded, a small, hesitant movement that felt like a victory. "Okay, but it's going to take time." James's heart swelled with a fragile hope. "I'm here for as long as it takes." They left the cafe soon after, the tension still lingering in the air, but softened by the promise of a new beginning. As James watched Claire and Marie walk away, he felt a mix of emotions: relief, hope, and a profound sense of responsibility. He knew that earning Marie's trust would be a long and difficult road, but he was ready to take it one step at a time. James leaned against his car, parked outside the small suburban house Claire and Marie called home. The morning air was crisp and clear, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. His stomach churned with a mix of excitement and anxiety. Today was a big day, a chance to start rebuilding the trust he had lost. The door opened, and Claire stepped out, followed by Marie. James's heart skipped a beat at the sight of her. She was dressed casually, her long hair pulled back into a ponytail. She looked every bit the teenager she was, and yet there was a guardedness in her expression that made his chest tighten. "Hey," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Ready for the big day?" Marie shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "It's just a carnival." Claire gave him an encouraging smile. "She's been working hard on the decorations for her class booth," she said. "It's a big deal." James nodded, grateful for the hint. "I'm sure you've done an amazing job," he said to Marie. "I can't wait to see it." Marie didn't respond, but her posture seemed to relax slightly. The three of them walked to his car, the silence heavy but not hostile. James opened the passenger door for Marie, who hesitated for a moment before climbing in. The drive to the school was quiet, filled with the kind of awkwardness that comes from trying to connect with someone you've been separated from for too long. James wanted to say something, to break the silence, but he didn't want to push her too hard. "So," he ventured after a few minutes, "what kind of booth did your class set up?" Marie glanced at him, then looked out the window. "It's a game booth. Ring toss. We made all the decorations ourselves." "That sounds great," James said, keeping his tone light. "I bet it looks amazing." Marie shrugged again, but there was a hint of pride in her voice. "Yeah, it turned out pretty good." The tension eased a little, and James felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. When they arrived at the school, the grounds were bustling with activity. Kids and parents moved between booths, the air filled with laughter and the smell of popcorn. Marie quickly excused herself to join her friends at the booth, leaving James and Claire standing alone. James watched her go, his heart aching with a longing he couldn't quite put into words. "She's trying, James," Claire said softly. "This isn't easy for her." "I know," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I just want to be there for her, Claire. I want her to know she can count on me." Claire's eyes softened. "You're doing fine. Just keep showing up. That's what matters." James nodded, feeling a surge of determination. He spent the next hour wandering through the carnival, watching kids play games and parents chat. He kept an eye on Marie, who was busy at her booth, explaining the game to a group of younger students. She looked happy, focused, and it struck him how much he had missed. After a while, he mustered the courage to approach her booth. Marie noticed him coming and tensed slightly, but she didn't turn away. "Hey," he said, offering a tentative smile. "This looks great. You did an awesome job." Marie glanced at him, then back at the game. "Thanks." James hesitated, then picked up one of the rings. "Mind if I give it a try?" Marie shrugged. "Sure, but it's harder than it looks." James threw the ring, and it bounced off the edge of one of the bottles. He laughed, shaking his head. "You weren't kidding." Marie's lips twitched, and she gave him a sideways glance. "It takes practice." Encouraged, James tried again, this time landing the ring squarely on the bottle. He turned to Marie, grinning. "Beginner's luck?" Marie rolled her eyes, but there was a hint of amusement in her expression. "Maybe." They played a few more rounds, the conversation light and easy. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. James felt like he was finally breaking through, if only a little. As the day wound down, James found himself back at Marie's booth, helping her clean up. She seemed more relaxed now, the guardedness in her expression replaced by a cautious curiosity. "You did a great job today," he said, stacking some of the leftover prizes. "I'm really proud of you." Marie glanced at him, then back at the box she was packing. "Thanks," she murmured. "It wasn't that big of a deal." "It is to me," James said softly, his voice sincere. "Seeing you like this, doing something you love, it means a lot." Marie didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either. They worked in silence for a while, the quiet comfortable rather than strained. When they were done, Marie looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Are you coming to the parent-teacher night next week?" she asked suddenly, the question catching him off guard. James's heart leapt. "If you want me there, I'll be there," he promised, his voice steady. Marie nodded slowly, almost as if she was testing him. "Okay, I want you to come." He swallowed, fighting the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." As they walked back to the car, James felt a warmth spreading through him, a sense of hope he hadn't dared to feel before. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but he was beginning to see the possibility of something real, something worth fighting for. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time, he felt like he wasn't walking it alone, and that was more than enough to keep him going. That evening, James sat in his apartment, the quiet solitude of the space pressing down on him. His mind replayed the events of the day at the carnival, the small steps he had taken toward reconnecting with Marie. He could still see the cautious hope in her eyes, the tentative way she had opened up just a little. It was a fragile start, but it was more than he had dared to hope for. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a notification from his social media account. An old friend had tagged him in a post. Curious, he clicked on it, and a flood of images filled the screen. They were photos from years ago, snapshots of his younger self, laughing, carefree, a drink in hand, surrounded by people whose faces were blurred by the fog of time. James felt a pang of regret as he scrolled through the pictures. He remembered those days all too well, the reckless nights, the parties, the constant chase for something he could never quite grasp. It was a life defined by excess and ambition, and he had thought it was everything he wanted. But looking back now, it all seemed so empty. The doorbell rang, startling him. Frowning, he stood and made his way to the door, wondering who could be visiting at this hour. When he opened it, his heart sank. Marie stood there, her face pale and tense, her eyes red-rimmed as if she had been crying. "Marie?" he said, his voice filled with concern. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pushed past him into the apartment, her movements stiff and agitated. James closed the door, anxiety tightening his chest. He turned to face her, but before he could say anything, she whirled around, holding up her phone. "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded, her voice breaking with anger and hurt. James blinked, confused. "Tell you what?" Marie's hands shook as she thrust the phone toward him. On the screen was one of the photos he had just seen. His younger self, grinning wildly, clearly drunk, surrounded by a group of equally intoxicated friends. There were comments beneath the photo, casual mentions of parties and reckless nights, a life that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. "Everyone at school knows," Marie said, her voice cracking. "They're talking about you, about how you were just some messed-up party guy. They're saying you're not a real dad, that you're just pretending to care." James felt a wave of shame wash over him. He hadn't thought about how his past might affect Marie now, hadn't considered how it would look to her friends, to anyone who saw these photos. He opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off, her voice rising. "No, you don't get to talk," she shouted, her body trembling with the force of her emotions. "You don't get to show up now and act like you're some great guy, like you care, when you were never there for us." James felt his heart shatter. He took a step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Marie, please, just listen. I'm not that person anymore. I've changed. I know I made mistakes, so many mistakes, but I'm trying to be better now." Marie shook her head, her eyes blazing with fury and pain. "You think saying you've changed makes everything okay? Do you have any idea what it was like for me, growing up without a dad? Watching other kids with their families, knowing mine was broken before I was even born." James's throat tightened, and he struggled to find the right words. "I'm so sorry, Marie. I know I can't change what happened. I can't make up for all those lost years. But I want to be here for you now. I want to prove to you that I can be the father you deserve." She laughed bitterly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "It's too late for that. You can't just show up and act like you care. I don't need you to be my dad. I don't need you at all." The words cut him to the core, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had known this wouldn't be easy. Marie's anger, her hurt, they were justified. He had to show her that he could handle it, that he was committed to earning her trust, no matter how long it took. "Marie," he said softly, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I understand why you're angry. I understand if you hate me, but I'm not going to walk away this time. I'm here, and I'm not leaving." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he thought she might lash out physically, might do anything to make him feel the pain she was carrying inside. But then she just shook her head, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion. "You don't get it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't even know who you are. You're just some guy who showed up one day and said he's my dad. But you're not. You're a stranger." The truth of her words stung, but he nodded slowly. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm a stranger to you, and that's my fault. But I want to change that. I want to get to know you, to be someone you can count on." Marie looked away, her expression unreadable. "I don't know if I can ever trust you," she murmured, almost to herself. "Everyone says you're just pretending, that you'll get bored and leave when it gets hard." James felt a surge of desperation. "That's not true, Marie. I'm not going anywhere. I'm here for the long haul, no matter what." She looked back at him then, her eyes filled with tears and something else, something that looked like hope, fragile and flickering. "Promise?" He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment. "I promise," he said, his voice firm. "I won't leave you. Not ever again." Marie stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to gauge the sincerity of his words. Then she nodded, a small, hesitant movement. "Okay," she whispered. "But if you lie to me, if you leave again, I'll never forgive you." James felt his heart swell with a mixture of pain and hope. "I won't," he vowed. "I'm not going to let you down again." She wiped at her eyes, her expression still guarded but a little softer. I don't know how to do this," she admitted quietly. "I don't know how to be your daughter." James felt a lump form in his throat. "We'll figure it out together," he said gently, "one step at a time." She nodded, and for the first time, she looked at him with something other than anger or hurt. There was still so much distance between them, so much healing left to do. But in that moment, James felt a glimmer of hope that they might be able to bridge the gap. They stood there for a while, neither of them speaking, just sharing the silence. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. It was a beginning. When Marie finally left, James watched her go, his heart aching with a mix of love and regret. He knew there would be more hard days ahead, more moments of anger and hurt, but he was determined to face them, to be the father she needed him to be. As he closed the door behind her, he let out a long breath, feeling the weight of the promise he had made. He knew he couldn't afford to fail her again. He would do whatever it took to prove that he was here to stay, that he was ready to be her dad, no matter how hard it got. For the first time in his life, James felt like he was finally on the right path. It was a difficult road, but it was one worth traveling, because at the end of it was the one thing he had always wanted but never realized he needed: family. James sat at his office desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. The usual excitement he felt about closing deals and negotiating contracts was completely absent. The noise of the bustling office around him felt distant, almost surreal, as his thoughts drifted back to Marie. Her words from the night before echoed in his mind, each one laced with pain and tentative hope. The weight of his promise felt heavier than anything he had ever carried before. He knew earning her trust would be a long road, but he was willing to do whatever it took. He had spent too many years focused on the wrong things: success, status, money. Now, he was determined not to make the same mistake again. He needed to show Marie and Claire that he was serious about being in their lives. His phone buzzed, pulling him back to the present. It was a text from his business partner, Sam. "Meeting with the investors at 3 p.m. We need to lock this deal down. This is huge, James." James felt his stomach twist. The deal they were working on was significant, potentially game-changing for the company. But it was also risky, involving some gray areas that made him uncomfortable. He knew he could push it through. His reputation and skill made him one of the best in the field, but something about it didn't sit right with him. He thought about Claire's voice on the phone earlier that morning, calm but firm as she told him about a job offer she had received. "It's a great opportunity, James. A position in Seattle, closer to my family. And I think it could be good for Marie, too, to have a fresh start." The words had hit him like a punch to the gut. Moving away? After everything they had been through, just when he felt he was beginning to connect with Marie, they might be leaving? The thought of losing the fragile progress they had made was unbearable. He needed to prove to Claire that he was committed, that he could provide the stability and support Marie needed right here. But if he went through with this deal, and it went south, the fallout could be disastrous. Not just for the business, but for his relationship with Claire and Marie. James knew he was at a crossroads. He could continue down the path that had defined him for so long, chasing success and financial gain. Or he could make a choice that truly reflected the man he wanted to become. With a deep breath, he picked up his phone and dialed Sam's number. His partner answered on the second ring, his voice tense with urgency. "James, where are you? We need to prep for this meeting. The investors are already on board. We just need you to seal the deal." James hesitated, his heart pounding. "Sam, I've been thinking. I don't think we should move forward with this deal." There was a stunned silence on the other end. "What are you talking about? We've been working on this for months. You're the one who brought them to the table." "I know," James said, forcing himself to stay calm. "But it's too risky. There are too many variables we can't control, and if it goes wrong, it could ruin us." "James, this is insane." Sam's voice was sharp, incredulous. "We're talking millions here. You're just going to walk away?" James closed his eyes, Marie's face flashing in his mind, her eyes filled with that fragile hope. "It's not worth it, Sam. Not at the cost it could come at." There was a long, tense silence. Finally, Sam spoke, his voice low and furious. "You're throwing away everything we've built. For what? For some misplaced sense of morality?" "For my family," James said quietly, the words firm and unyielding. "I need to be there for them, not chasing deals that could blow up in my face." Sam let out a harsh laugh. "So that's it? You're just walking away?" "I'm not walking away," James replied, his voice steady. "I'm choosing a different path, one that actually means something." He ended the call, his heart pounding. He knew Sam was furious, and the fallout from this decision would be significant, but he felt an overwhelming sense of relief. He had made the right choice, one that was not about money or success, but about being the man he needed to be for Marie and Claire. That evening, he drove to Claire's house. The thought of her leaving still terrified him, but he knew he had to talk to her, to show her that he was serious. When she answered the door, her expression was wary, as if she could sense that something was different. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. "Can we talk?" She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. They sat down at the kitchen table, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. "Claire," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I know you've been thinking about moving, and I understand why, but I need you to know that I'm committed to being here, to being part of Marie's life. I've made some changes, big ones. I want to be the father she needs, and I can't do that if you're in Seattle." Claire's eyes softened, but she still looked guarded. "James, I appreciate that you're trying, I really do. But Marie has been through so much. This isn't just about you showing up. It's about what's best for her." "I know," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I know I've been absent, and I'm not trying to take the easy way out. But I've made a decision today. I turned down a deal that could have made me a lot of money because it wasn't right. I'm putting my focus on Marie, on being here for her, no matter what." Claire's eyes widened in surprise. You turned it down?" James nodded. "I did, because it's more important for me to be a good father than a successful businessman. I can't lose her, Claire, not after finally finding her." She was silent for a long moment, her gaze searching his face. "You really mean that, don't you?" "I do," he said, his voice steady. "I know it's going to take time, and I know I have to prove myself, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Claire let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "James, I've wanted this for so long, for you to be part of her life. But I need to see that this isn't just temporary, that you're not going to get bored or frustrated and walk away. I won't, he promised, his voice firm. I'm here for the long haul, no matter what. Claire looked down, her expression thoughtful. I haven't made a decision about the move yet, but if you're serious about this, about being here, then maybe we can find a way to make it work. James felt a surge of hope, his heart pounding in his chest. Thank you, he said quietly. That means more to me than you know. They talked for a while longer, and for the first time in a long time, the conversation felt easy, natural. There were still so many things to work through, so many wounds to heal, but he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. When he left that night, his mind was racing with possibilities. He had a long road ahead, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. He had chosen his family over everything else, and that was the only thing that truly mattered. As he drove home, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Marie. Thanks for standing up for me. I heard about the deal. Maybe we can hang out again soon. James felt his eyes sting with unshed tears. It was a small step, just a few words, but it was everything. He typed back quickly. Anytime, Marie. I'm here whenever you're ready. He put his phone down, a smile spreading across his face. For the first time, he felt like he was truly building something real and lasting. And he knew, deep down, that he would never let anything come between him and his family again. James stood outside the small brick house, his heart pounding. He hadn't been to this part of town in years. It was quiet, almost eerily so, with only the distant hum of traffic and the faint sound of children playing somewhere down the street. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, and knocked on the door. It opened slowly, and an older woman peered out at him, her eyes narrowing in confusion. James? She asked, her voice uncertain. Hi, Mrs. Green, James said, offering a tentative smile. I know it's been a long time. I wanted to talk to you about something. Mrs. Green stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books, just as he remembered. It was filled with the warmth of familiarity, a place that had once felt like a sanctuary during his chaotic childhood. Mrs. Green had been more than just a neighbor. She had been a second mother, a constant source of stability when his own family life had been anything but. I didn't expect to see you, she said as they settled into the living room. It's been, 15 years? Something like that, James replied, feeling a pang of guilt. I'm sorry I haven't been in touch. Mrs. Green waved his apology away. Life gets busy. You've always been one to keep moving. But why are you here now, James? What's going on? James took a deep breath, his heart racing. I need to know something about the past, about what happened with Claire and Marie. Mrs. Green's eyes softened, but there was a shadow of sadness in them. I always wondered when you'd come looking for answers. James's stomach tightened. So there is something I don't know? She nodded, looking down at her hands. You were in a bad place back then, James. We all saw it. And Claire, she was scared. Scared for you, but mostly for the baby. James felt his throat tighten. What do you mean? Mrs. Green sighed, the weight of years settling into her shoulders. Claire told me about the pregnancy before she told you. She was worried, so worried. You were drinking too much, working too much, never home. She didn't know what to do. And then, when Marie was born, she trailed off, her voice breaking slightly. What happened? James asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. She was born with a heart defect, Mrs. Green said quietly. It was serious, James. They weren't sure she would make it. Claire was beside herself. She had to make some really hard decisions, and she had to make them alone because you weren't there. James felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. A heart defect? I didn't know. I had no idea. I know you didn't, Mrs. Green said gently. Claire didn't tell you because she didn't think you could handle it. You were already spiraling. She didn't want to add to that burden, didn't want to give you hope only to have it shattered. James's mind was spinning. He felt a surge of anger, not at Claire, but at himself. How could he have been so blind, so consumed by his own life that he had missed something so important? She did everything she could to keep Marie safe, Mrs. Green continued. She was in and out of the hospital for the first 2 years. It was touch and go for a long time. That's why Claire left, James. She couldn't risk Marie's health with the chaos you brought into her life. James felt tears burn at the back of his eyes. I didn't know, he murmured, his voice thick with regret. I didn't know any of it. Mrs. Green reached out and took his hand, her grip firm and comforting. You didn't know because you weren't ready to know. Claire did what she thought was best for both of you. James nodded, unable to speak. He felt overwhelmed by the weight of everything he had missed, the pain Claire must have gone through alone, and the struggles his daughter had faced as a baby. He had been absent for all of it. I need to make this right, he said finally, his voice shaking. I don't know how, but I need to. Mrs. Green looked at him with a mix of sympathy and determination. The only way you can make it right is by being there now, for both of them. You can't change the past, James, but you can be the man they need now. He nodded, a sense of resolve hardening in his chest. I will be. I'm not going to let them down again. As he left Mrs. Green's house, his mind was racing. He drove straight to Claire's place, his heart pounding with the urgency of what he needed to say. When he knocked on the door, it was Marie who answered. She looked surprised to see him, but there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Hey, she said, stepping aside to let him in. What's going on? I need to talk to your mom, James said, his voice steady. Is she home? Marie nodded, glancing down the hallway. Yeah, she's in the kitchen. James followed her inside, his heart racing. When he entered the kitchen, Claire looked up, her expression a mix of surprise and concern. James, what's wrong? She asked, wiping her hands on a towel. You look shaken. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. I went to see Mrs. Green, he said quietly. She told me about what happened when Marie was born. Claire's face went pale, and she glanced at Marie, who was watching them with wide eyes. James, I didn't want you to find out like this. I needed to know, he said, his voice breaking. I needed to understand why you left, why you kept her from me. Claire took a deep breath, her eyes filling with tears. It wasn't just you, James. It was everything. I was scared. Scared for her. Scared for you. I didn't know if I could handle losing either of you. James felt his own tears welling up. I'm so sorry, Claire. I should have been there. I should have been the one holding your hand, not leaving you to face it alone. It wasn't your fault, she said softly, her voice breaking. You weren't ready, and Marie needed stability. She needed safety. I know that now, he said, his voice trembling. But I'm ready now. I want to be here, for both of you. I know I can't change the past, but I can be here now. Marie stepped forward, her face pale. What are you talking about? What happened? James turned to her, his heart aching at the confusion and fear in her eyes. You were really sick when you were a baby, he said gently. You had a heart problem, and your mom, she did everything she could to keep you safe. I wasn't there because I didn't know, but I'm here now, and I want to be part of your life. Marie's eyes filled with tears. You didn't know? James shook his head, feeling his own tears spill over. No, I didn't. I wish I had. I wish I could go back and be there for you. But I can't. All I can do is be here now. Marie looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then, slowly, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. James felt his heart swell as he held her, the weight of all those lost years crushing him, but the hope for the future filling him with a fierce determination. I love you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so proud of you, and I'm never going to leave you again. Marie clung to him, her body shaking with sobs, and Claire watched them, tears streaming down her own face. James met her eyes over Marie's head, and she gave him a small, tearful smile. You're doing it, James, she said softly. You're really doing it. He nodded, holding his daughter close, feeling the strength of her small body against his. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be more challenges ahead, but for the first time, he felt like he was finally where he was meant to be. They stood there for a long time, the three of them, together for the first time in what felt like forever. And as James held his daughter and looked into Claire's eyes, He knew that he would do whatever it took to keep this family together, to make up for the years they had lost, and to build a future filled with love, trust, and hope. The crisp autumn air carried a chill as James parked his car outside Claire's house. His heart was pounding with a mix of excitement and anxiety. He had planned this day meticulously, pouring every ounce of thought and emotion into it, hoping that it would show both Claire and Marie how serious he was about being part of their lives. He knew this was his chance to prove, not just with words but with actions, that he was truly committed. When he knocked on the door, it was Marie who answered. Her eyes widened in surprise at the sight of him, holding a small suitcase and a nervous smile playing on his lips. "What's all this?" she asked, glancing at the luggage. James took a deep breath, his pulse racing. "I have a surprise for you and your mom. It's something I've been thinking about for a while. Do you think she's up for a little trip?" Marie looked skeptical, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere special," James said softly. "A place that means a lot to me and your mom. I want to share it with you." Marie hesitated, then turned and called over her shoulder, "Mom, you need to come here." Claire appeared a moment later, wiping her hands on a dish towel. When she saw James standing there, her eyes widened in surprise. "James? What's going on?" "I know it's last minute," James said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I've planned a little trip for us, just for the weekend. I want to take you both somewhere that's important to me, to us. It's my way of showing you that I'm committed to this, to us as a family." Claire's brow furrowed with confusion, but there was a softness in her eyes, a hint of hope that hadn't been there before. "James, we can't just leave. We have plans, and Marie—" "Please," James interrupted gently. "I promise it'll be worth it. I've arranged everything. All I'm asking is for a chance to show you, both of you, what this means to me." Marie glanced at her mother, then back at James, and for a long moment, the air was thick with anticipation. Finally, Claire nodded, her expression cautious but curious. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's go." The drive to the cabin was long, winding through roads surrounded by tall pines and the vibrant hues of fall foliage. Marie sat in the back seat, earbuds in, her gaze occasionally drifting to the scenery outside. Claire sat beside James, silent but relaxed, her eyes focused on the road ahead. It had been years since they had taken a trip together like this, and the quiet companionship felt both strange and comforting. James had chosen the cabin because it held a special place in his heart. It was where he and Claire had spent one of their happiest weekends together, back when they were young and in love, before life and ambition had driven them apart. He remembered those days vividly. The laughter, the dreams they had shared, the feeling that they could conquer the world as long as they were together. As they pulled up to the cabin, nestled at the edge of a small, serene lake, Claire's eyes widened with recognition. "James," she breathed, her voice filled with a mixture of surprise and nostalgia. "This is where we spent our first anniversary," he finished softly, his eyes meeting hers. "I thought it might be a good place for us to start over." Marie got out of the car, looking around with interest. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "I've never been to a place like this." James smiled, his heart swelling with hope. "I'm glad you like it. I wanted to share this place with you. It's special to me, and I hope it can become special for us." They spent the afternoon exploring the area, walking along the lake and hiking through the nearby woods. The air was crisp and clear, filled with the scent of pine and the distant calls of birds. James watched Marie and Claire as they talked and laughed, his heart aching with a bittersweet joy. He knew he was still an outsider in many ways, but for the first time, he felt like he was truly part of something. That evening, after a simple dinner by the fire, James pulled out a small, worn box from his suitcase. He took a deep breath, then turned to Marie, his eyes filled with a mix of nervousness and hope. "Marie, there's something I want to give you," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. Marie looked at him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What is it?" James handed her the box, watching as she opened it carefully. Inside were a collection of letters, neatly stacked and tied with a ribbon. Marie glanced up at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "They're letters," James explained softly. "Letters I wrote to you over the years. I never had the courage to send them, but I wrote them anyway. I wanted you to know how much I thought about you, even when I didn't know where you were, or if you would ever want to know me." Marie's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at the letters, her fingers trembling slightly. "You wrote these for me?" James nodded, his throat tight. "Every single one. I know I wasn't there, and I know I have a lot to make up for. But I want you to have these. They're a part of me and a part of you. And I want you to know that I've always loved you, even when I wasn't there." Marie stared at the letters for a long moment, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Then, slowly, she reached out and took the box, holding it close to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. It means a lot." James felt a surge of relief and gratitude, his heart swelling with hope. He had spent so long feeling like an outsider, like he didn't deserve to be part of Marie's life. But now, for the first time, he felt like he was truly reaching her, connecting with her in a way he hadn't thought possible. They spent the rest of the evening talking, sharing stories and memories. James told Marie about his own childhood, the struggles and the joys, the mistakes he had made and the lessons he had learned. Claire shared her own experiences, and slowly, the three of them began to weave a new story together, one filled with love and forgiveness and the hope of a future that was brighter than the past. Later that night, as they sat by the fire, James turned to Claire, his heart pounding. He had one more thing he needed to say, one more gesture to make. "Claire," he said softly, his voice trembling with emotion, "I want you to have this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, handing it to her with a shaky hand. Claire looked at him, her eyes filled with confusion as she took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a deed, signed and notarized, transferring ownership of his business shares to her and Marie. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's my way of showing you that I'm serious," James said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I don't want you to ever feel like you have to leave, or that you're not secure. I want you and Marie to have everything you need, no matter what happens with me." Claire stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. "James, this is too much." "No, it's not," he said firmly. "I've spent too long chasing the wrong things. This is my way of putting my family first. I don't need the money, or the power, or the success. I just need you and Marie. That's all I want." Tears filled Claire's eyes as she looked at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "James, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he said softly, his eyes locked on hers. "Just let me be part of your life. Let me prove to you that I can be the man you and Marie deserve." Claire nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You already are, James. You already are." They sat there for a long time, the three of them, wrapped in the warmth of the fire and the glow of new beginnings. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but they were together. And that, James knew, was all that really mattered. As the fire burned low and the night deepened, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be, surrounded by the people he loved, ready to face whatever the future might hold. It was a new beginning, a fresh start, and as he looked at Claire and Marie, he knew that he would do whatever it took to keep this family together, to build a life filled with love and hope and endless possibilities. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of emotions and new routines. James found himself adjusting to a life that was both familiar and entirely new, balancing work, reconnecting with Claire, and, most importantly, building a relationship with Marie. Each day brought its own challenges and rewards, and he embraced them all with a determination that surprised even him. He and Claire had agreed to take things slowly, to see if they could rebuild the trust and love that had once defined their relationship. It wasn't easy. The wounds of the past were deep, and there were moments when old arguments and resentments resurfaced, threatening to tear them apart again. But they were both committed to trying, for their own sakes and for Marie's. One crisp Saturday morning, James found himself standing outside the high school gymnasium, his heart pounding with nervous anticipation. Marie had invited him to watch her basketball game, and he knew how much this meant, not just to her, but to him as well. It was another step forward, another chance to show her that he was here to stay. He spotted Claire in the bleachers, waving him over. She was bundled up in a thick sweater, her cheeks flushed with the cool autumn air. As he sat down beside her, she smiled, her eyes sparkling with warmth. "You made it," she said softly. James nodded, his gaze scanning the gym for any sign of Marie. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Claire's smile widened, and she reached out to squeeze his hand. "She's been talking about this game all week. She's nervous, but excited too. Having you here, it means a lot to her." James felt a lump form in his throat. "I just want her to know I'm here, that I'm not going anywhere." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the teams took their places on the court. When Marie jogged out with her teammates, James's heart swelled with pride. She looked confident, focused, her eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto him and Claire. A small, almost shy smile spread across her face, and James felt his heart swell with emotion. The game was intense, a back-and-forth battle that had everyone on the edge of their seats. Marie played with a fierce determination, her movements quick and precise. James found himself cheering and clapping, his heart racing with every shot and every steal. As the game neared its end, the score was tied, and the tension in the gym was palpable. With just seconds left on the clock, Marie found herself with the ball, dribbling toward the basket. James held his breath as she dodged her defender and took the shot. The ball arced through the air, the entire gym falling silent as it sailed toward the hoop. And then, with a soft swish, it fell through the net, sealing the victory for her team. The crowd erupted in cheers, and James felt a surge of pride and joy that nearly overwhelmed him. He stood, clapping and shouting her name, his heart pounding with exhilaration. Marie's teammates rushed to her, hugging and congratulating her, but her eyes were on him. She broke away from the group and ran toward the bleachers, her face glowing with excitement. "You did it," James shouted, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You were amazing." Marie grinned, her cheeks flushed with happiness. "Thanks, Dad." The word hit him like a bolt of lightning, and for a moment, he was speechless. She had never called him that before, never used the word Dad with him. It was a small thing, just 3 letters, but it meant more than anything he had ever heard. "I'm so proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were incredible." Marie beamed, and then, to his astonishment, she threw her arms around him, hugging him tightly. James hugged her back, his heart bursting with love and gratitude. "I'm glad you were here," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shoulder. It made all the difference. James felt tears sting his eyes, and he held her even tighter. "I'll always be here, Marie. Always." As they pulled back, Claire joined them, her eyes filled with tears of her own. She wrapped her arms around both of them, and for a moment, they stood there, the 3 of them, a family united in a way that felt both fragile and unbreakable. The rest of the day passed in a joyful blur. They celebrated Marie's victory with her teammates and then went out for dinner, laughing and talking like they had been doing this all their lives. James felt a peace and happiness that he hadn't known in years, a sense that everything was finally falling into place. That night, as they sat in Claire's living room, Marie turned to him, her expression serious. "There's something I want to talk to you about." James felt a flicker of anxiety. "Of course, anything." Marie glanced at Claire, who nodded encouragingly. "It's about my heart condition," she said quietly. "I know you didn't know about it before, but I want you to be part of everything now. I want you to come with me to my next checkup." James's heart ached with a mixture of love and regret. "I'd be honored, Marie. I want to be there for you, every step of the way." Marie nodded, her eyes shining with gratitude. "It means a lot to me. I want you to know what's going on, to understand." "I do," James said softly, "and I'm so proud of how strong you are. You've been through so much, and you've come out stronger." Marie smiled, and for the first time, it felt like a bridge had been truly built between them, one that could withstand whatever challenges lay ahead. As the evening wound down and Marie went to bed, James and Claire sat together on the couch, the quiet of the house wrapping around them like a warm blanket. "I think we're getting there," Claire said softly, her head resting on his shoulder. "I think we're really going to be okay." James nodded, his heart full. "We are," he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet, fierce determination. "We're going to be okay." And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. The months that followed were a time of growth and healing for all three of them. James continued to be a constant presence in Marie's life, attending her doctor's appointments, cheering at her games, and even helping her with school projects. They had found a rhythm, a new kind of normal that felt both familiar and precious. His relationship with Claire also deepened, slowly but surely. They took their time, rebuilding the trust that had been shattered years ago. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt and fear, but they faced them together, hand in hand. One crisp winter evening, they found themselves back at the cabin by the lake. The snow lay thick on the ground, blanketing the world in a quiet stillness. They had come back to celebrate the new year, a symbolic gesture to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Marie had insisted on bringing the letters James had given her, and they spent the evening reading them aloud, sharing stories and memories, and laughing at the awkward, heartfelt words James had written so many years ago. As midnight approached, they stood outside, bundled up against the cold, watching as the stars twinkled overhead. The air was crisp and clear, filled with the promise of new beginnings. "I can't believe we're here," Claire said softly, her breath misting in the cold air. "It feels like a dream." "It's real," James replied, his voice filled with quiet wonder. "We're really here, together." Marie stood between them, her gaze fixed on the stars. "I'm glad we are," she said quietly. "I'm glad we're finally a family." James felt his heart swell with emotion, and he reached out, taking her hand in his. "Me too, sweetheart. More than I can say." They stood there in silence, watching as the seconds ticked down to midnight. When the clock struck 12, James turned to Claire, his heart pounding with anticipation and hope. "Claire," he said softly, his voice trembling slightly, "I have something I need to ask you." She looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "What is it?" James took a deep breath, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. He opened it, revealing a delicate ring, simple but elegant, with a single, sparkling diamond. "Claire," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "I know we've been through so much, and I know I've made so many mistakes, but I love you. I've always loved you, and I want to spend the rest of my life making up for lost time. Will you marry me?" Claire's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, she was speechless. Then she nodded, a radiant smile breaking across her face. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, James, I'll marry you." James felt a surge of joy so intense it took his breath away. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling, and then pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the world seemed to blur around them. Marie cheered, her face glowing with happiness. "I knew it," she shouted, laughing as she hugged them both. "I knew you two would end up together." They laughed, the sound echoing through the crisp night air, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. The past was still there, still part of them, but it no longer defined them. They had found a way to move forward, to build something new and beautiful out of the broken pieces. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, James felt a sense of peace and contentment that he had never known before. He had found his family, his place in the world, and he knew that he would do whatever it took to keep them together. The future stretched out before them, filled with endless possibilities. And as he looked at Claire and Marie, he knew that they would face whatever came their way together, with love and strength and hope. It was a new beginning, a story rewritten, and James knew that this time, he wouldn't let anything come between them. They were a family, and they were finally whole. And as they stood there, the stars shining above, James felt a quiet, unshakable certainty settle over him. They were going to be okay.